I think for every perceptive, follower of the events in Manipur that unfold since last May 2023, the structural source of this violence is amply clear. So I have argued in my works in the various newspaper opinions that I publish that this structural violence, in effect, has been prepared by the state in ways that converse and overlapped with majoritarian minded Meitei civil society groups. So, to the extent that these became apparent not just before the start of this violence, but also subsequent for the next 1 year, suggests that the structural forms of violence that manifests itself in this violence for 1 year is reinforcing and being validated. I think it is for the public to decide whether they believed or see how these structural source of violence are now endemic to perpetuating violence in Manipur. But unfortunately, you have a set of distorted narrative which people chose to believe in. And that is precisely where the challenge is. How do you debunk some of these distorted narratives which have mollified the intents in terms of stereotyping or otherizing a particular community is asked to subserve to the electoral interest of the powers that be. So, if it is not clear by now to this public at large, I think a whole democratic institutional experience is in peril. And I think it is for the public at large to come together and realize that the public cannot allow this mayhem to continue unless you want this geographical as well as demographic divide to be the new buffer zones, which in effect laid down the foundation of the territorial disintegration of the state of Manipur. So defenders of the territorial integrity of Manipur should now come around that this particular vicious politics, which ethnicize on issues of encroachment, on issues of poppy cultivation, or on issues of quote-unquote illegal immigrants, should now realize that these are lopsided argument, which in effect points to how lawless law enforcement in the state, by stereotyping a particular community, is far from the realities. And unless people come together and confront this, unfortunate, distorted narratives, I think what left to be salvaged would be very less. And given that there is a drastic disruption of the shared territorial space in Manipur, in the overweening ambition to bring about territorial integrity, intercommunal trust has broken down, reached the lowest minimum now. And how do you restore public trust, mutual belief in the fact that the institutions are fair and just, and accords, protection of rights of all citizens? And these are some of the, very important challenges that come out of this whole madness. The Prime Minister told claim, for example, in early April, that the timely intervention of the central government has salvaged the situation in Manipur. Or Amit Shah's statement in his electoral campaign, the second time only that he visited the state of Manipur, not for expressing his empathy or his concern of the relentless violation of what he calls the buffer zones that was put in place, since his visit just within 1 month of the outbreak of this violence towards the end of May 2023, for example, has been considered for as one of the practical way of breaking the impasse and forestalling the spread of violence into the rural areas. Remember that the first month, especially the first 15 to 20 days, violence was concentrated in the urban towns. and it gradually, spread out to the rural areas. And the nature of violence also changed its character, despite the fact that the visit of Amit Shah and the idea of this buffer zone, which was probably an idea ideated by Amit Shah, the Home Minister, in consultation with the security establishment. Remember that the Unified Security Command was put in place under the hat of Kuldip Singh. And this was considered to be a very tactical as well as pragmatic consideration, given that much of the offensive strikes comes from the very armed militant groups, Arambai Tengol, and the extensive report of involvement of secessionists, proscribed armed Meitei organizations, whose involvement had been reported very extensively in mainstream national media. So, despite this fact, the very fact that the idea of, for example, national security, by invoking that much of this problem has been caused by the Lungi-clads, Kuki Zhou militants, which transgressed across the border, was trumpeted at one point of time without any substantive evidence on the ground, right? So much so that Tushar Mehta, the Solicitor General of India, in one of his deposition before the Supreme Court, considered that some of the 87 dead bodies which were killed by armed Meitei mobs in Imphal, kept in various morgues of Imphal hospitals for over 7 to 8 months, were quote-unquote infiltrators, right? To reinforce this narrative that the Kuki Zhou pose the gravest danger to India's national security. But contrary-wise, the Su group, the Kuki Zhou groups or the Zomi groups, are party to the suspension of agreement which has been put in place since 2008, which suggests that they had never challenged the territorial integrity of India and therefore posed no threat whatsoever, because they had been contained within the military camps that was brought about by this mechanism called the Su Agreement, right? So to that extent that this is a distorted narrative which sought to project the Kuki Zomi Mar group as a larger part of that distorted narrative, projecting them as if they are the problematic others. That's one. Even on the question of illegal immigrants, if you look at very closely, Biren Singh, the Chief Minister himself, in an interview during the India Today conclave in 2018, which is still available online, stated that there was no illegal immigrants in 2018, which is 5 years before. And he accepted the fact that in 2018, 7 Rohingyas were nabbed in the state and they are being deported back to Myanmar, right? And he also, in effect, accepted the fact that the Indo-Myanmar border is porous and therefore illegal immigrants pose a threat, without hinting whatsoever of the involvement of the Kuki, Zomi, or Mar groups, which are now being stereotyped as posing the gravest territorial threat to India and, for that matter, to Manipur, right? So in that sense, you'll find that the Chief Minister's position has changed drastically, 360-degree change almost, as it were, because by 2019, when his office, as well as various civil society organizations in various social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, continuously spit venom against the Kuki Zomi groups as if most of them are illegal immigrants. So the latest salvo from the Chief Minister, just maybe 5 days ago, 5 days or more, suggests that over 966 villages have suddenly come up between 2016 and till this date, without proving any evidence whatsoever. So some of these facts have to be confronted on their face value, because after all, the recognition of villages started with the village authority and the district council. And the district council, because once a village is set up, it is incumbent upon the chief to make representation to the autonomous district council for recommending that demand to the district commissioner. And once the district commissioner processes the matter, it is sent to the state government. And once the state government clears the matter, it is published in the state gazette. So to that extent, it is the full complicity of the state government. And instead of casting the blame or fixing accountability and responsibility on the laps of the state machinery itself, or the procedural corruption that seeped in the process of this, you ethnicize the whole matter just to kind of project a particular narrative which suits the powers that be in kind of justifying this violence. So in that sense, I think this idea of illegal immigrants is also deeply problematic, because the state cabinet subcommittee itself in April 2023, 1 month before the outbreak of violence, have identified hardly around 2,000, right? And most of these who had been identified are being rehabilitated, and there is no threat whatsoever. But why is it suddenly that is just in a span of 2 to 3 years, you have whip up a mass hysteria around the so-called illegal immigrants? And remember that there is also a change in narrative, in the sense that in the mid-1990s and early 2000, the major target of these so-called migrant laborers is not on Indo-Myanmar border side, but on the Marwaris, on the Biharis. So much so that this Arambai, Bengal, and Meitei Lipun, which operate within a larger institutional ecosystem, in effect, have find great problem with demographic threat posed by migrant outsiders from mainland India, quote unquote, right? They call it the Mayangs, as it were. And now suddenly you change the narrative and flip the side of the coin to castigate the entire Kuki, Zomi, Mar communities as if they are in collusion in ways that pose demographic as well as territorial threat to the territorial integrity of Manipur is quite distorted and unacceptable. The third is, as you pointed out, on the issue of narco-terrorism, for example. If you look at the war on drugs that Biren Singh government, the BJP government, launched from 2018, one of the greatest critic of that is none other than the former, police officer who is in charge of narcotics as well as border affairs. And she wrote a very provocative article in the Outlook, and she has also reiterated this point in various media interviews that she gave, that this is one of the greatest hoax that Biren Singh and his government played on the people, because she considered that the major kingpin of this drug is none other than Biren Singh and some of the high-ranking cabinet minister who have in direct or indirect collusion with the warlords, as it were. So in that sense, you have also got to understand that the superintendent of police who is in charge of border and narcotics, right, border affairs and narcotics, in his report between 2017 to 2021-22, for example, identified that all communities are involved. So why would a particular community be singled out and targeted as if they are solely responsible for, the drug menace in the state is highly distorted and highly unacceptable. And this type of narrative, can easily be debunked with, actually existing realities on the ground, because after all, because Manipur is located on the fringe of what we call the Golden Triangle, which is flush with international drug as well as arms trade. All communities, including the Meitei armed militants, as well as the powers that be the bureaucracy, as well as the political elites, are involved, deeply involved in, playing conduits to this drug as well as arms mafia across the border. So, therefore, it is important that the public now realize that these are very distorted, very parochial type of way of looking at it, which unnecessarily ethnicize which is otherwise issue of purely law and order issue. And instead of castigating a particular community, I think we should as citizens, informed citizens, fix accountability and responsibility with the state. Because after all, Biren Singh is the Home Minister of the state, who is in charge of the home affairs of the state. And if he is not able to control all these issues, whether illegal immigration, whether it is narco-terrorism or national security threat, the onus lies squarely on him. On the second part of your question, how complicit is the central government in doing this? I think one of the ways in which the central government does not seem to be serious in addressing this is that after having waited for 1 year, and after having, trying to manage this as a political event management, it has utterly failed. If the BJP pride itself in a double-engine sarkar or double-engine government, if one of the engine in the state is malfunctioning and seriously collapsing, it should replace with someone else who could effectively, shoulder that responsibility. And Biren Singh for 1 year has shown his full incompetence and how communal as a chief minister is. It is unprecedented to witness, for example, in any state in India, that a reigning chief minister is not able to visit, one part of the state, which in effect has more than 16% of the population, which is quite scary, right? And it should not be a precedent, because it set a very dangerous precedent. The chief minister should be able to rise above board and speak for all communities. But we have here the powers that be, not just the chief minister, but some of the powerful, cabinet rank ministers as well as MLAs based in the valley area, speaking as if they are, speaking only from a particular region, that is the valley areas. That's one point. The second point, which I think is also important, is that the reluctance of the central government to impose president rule, given that there is a stark failure of constitutional machinery in the state. And despite the fact that the Unified Security Command is in place for 1 year now, almost 1 year now, and given that much of the transgression across the buffer zone, which in effect is instituted with the involvement of central government, is violated at will by the armed Meitei militants, including Arambai Tengul and secessionist proscribed armed organization based in the valleys, which essentially means that proper political directives are not given to the central paramilitary force, which are supposed to secure, the foothills where the Kuki Zomi Mar lives from relentless aggression or transgression from this armed militant organization. And given that the Mera Paibis, for example, had also played a very kind of supportive role in blocking, central paramilitary force from securing wherever, there is an attack on these foothill areas where the Kuki, the Zhou group lives, suggests that there is a short supply of political will if there is a conspicuous absence of it. So in that sense, I think the central government must now, wake up from its slumber and start, really addressing this, because after all, you cannot antagonize one of the major transnational tribes. In fact, the Kuki, Zomi, Mar groups are considered to be one of the biggest tribes in the entire Southeast Asia, and you cannot have, border security or territorial security of India unless you keep them happy, right? So India's Lookis policy, for example, would totally collapse if you antagonize the Kuki, Zomi, the Mar groups who are spread across Myanmar and Bangladesh and all these areas. So in that sense, for India's security interests, and also for the fact that the Kuki, Zhou groups are Indian citizens, they are legitimate Indian citizens, let us segregate between who are illegal, right, and who are armed dealers, irrespective of the communities that they are located. Nab them and give more capacity to the institution as well as to the state in ways that is more objective without ethnicizing all this matter. Then the problem would be resolved. But unfortunately, the central government and the state government does not seem to be invested in this. And that is precisely where I argue that the structural violence in Manipur continue unabated till today. I think one of the ways in which this can be thought about is in terms of the deeper levels of penetration of these distorted narratives and how it leverage mutual distrust, suspicion, and even hatred to the extent that it assumed a form of civil war now, right? Because the kind of language that people at the societal level use is war, right? The Métis would say it is a Kuki war, and the Kuki would say it is a Métis war, right? So to that extent that the very fact that despite the fact that this is something which is a demonstration of the deep involvement of the state and its institutional apparatus, I think it is unfortunate that prolonged cycle of violence has deeply penetrated into the minds and psyche of the people in ways that antagonize their relationship. And that is precisely where I suggest, for example, that in a diverse, deeply divided, segmented society like Manipur, one of the ways in which, if at all you want to build unity across communities or across territorial divide, is through accommodation, right? Or through power sharing mechanism. And unless these are institutionalized and institutions are seen to be legitimate and trustworthy, you have what we call legitimacy crisis. And when you have legitimacy crisis, you have ethnicization or communalized politics or polarized politics, the kind of which you now see since in very aggressive form since 3rd May 2023. So one of the ways of retrieving that shared space or a semblance of power sharing or a feeling of reviving that sense of unity is, after all, to establish the legitimacy of the state, which Michael Mann, the eminent sociologist, call it the infrastructural power of the state. So this infrastructural power of the state is, according to Michael Mann, understood in terms of first the capacity of the state to extract revenues, right? And second is, of course, the ability of the state to impose rule of law, right? So the rule of law has been compromised. And you see how the political establishment in Manipur today openly sided with the majority community in terms of delivery of service, in the delivery of, for example, compensation to persons killed, right? A police inspector who was killed was immediately, sought to be compensated with 50 lakhs. And a similar policeman who was killed was not even mentioned in the press brief that the chief minister holds, right? Or you see some of these, David Thiek, for example, whose head was decapitated, whose impaled head was hanged, and whose head was, carried by an allegedly a former PA of a prominent MLA, member of Legislative Assembly, in effect has been scot-free till today. And you also have some of these leaders like, for example, Pramod Singh. Look at his 28 April Facebook post, which has been recounted. It is an open incitement to genocide against the Kuki, Zomi, as well as the Mar groups. He has been scot-free, right? No charge frame against him. Forget about the conviction. Or the Arambai Tengol, who openly instigate his followers as if the worst of the war is yet to begin, right? Instigating, and he has been caught in national television, in effect injured in his involvement in some of this offensive strike. No charge framed, no arrest made, no justice delivered. So after all, the state has this that onerous responsibility of rising above communal interests. And that is precisely where I say, if the state has to regain legitimacy, it has to establish rule of law. And rule of law is not just that all individuals in the state are treated equally, but there has to be equal protection of the law. They should be accorded equal protection by the state. And so long as this unequal protection continue to persist, the level of trust and legitimacy of the state and its institutions would seriously erode. That's one. The second part is that if at all the idea of shared spirit is to be, restituted, I think this integrationist and majoritarian agenda must be abandoned. Because after all, to argue that, for example, the Hills Valley divide in Manipur is a colonial construct, the kind of intellectual justification that you hear, not just from the poor's that beef, but from some of the front-ranking Métis intellectuals who come to the national television and who kind of argue that these are what they call it, a very twisted outcome of colonial modernity, is to be oblivious to the fact that this Hills Valley divide preceded the onset of colonialism in Manipur, right? Because, for example, if you look at the institution of the political agency itself, which I outline in my quaint article, one of the first articles that I wrote in the wake of this violence, is to suggest that this political agency, which was established since 1835 in the southern part of Manipur, is an attempt to regulate the disorderly relations between the southern tribes, the Sukti tribes, along with the Métis King based in the valleys, because the Métis King had not been able to regulate or prevail upon the powerful Sukti tribes. An invitation was sent out to the British to intervene in the form of institutional mechanism called the British political agent, right? And since then, 1835, you have from 1907 the Durbar system. And the Durbar system is a historical outgrowth of this disparate, separate, distinctive institutional arrangement. And interestingly, for the first time, the vice chairman, who is drawn from the British officer, is given the exclusive power to regulate the hill affairs on the contention of ethnocultural distinctiveness. And second is the past, quote-unquote, cruel dealings that the Métis Kings had with the hill tribes, right? So the British, for example, thought it wise and prudent administratively to shoulder that responsibility in order to establish confidence, trust, and legitimacy of the institution that they have, which in effect has this kind of division of power or separation of powers, right? And this continued when Manipur, in effect, transformed itself, the monarchy transformed into constitutional democracy by framing its own constitution in June 1947, whereby a separate regulation for the hill areas was put in place, which recognized this distinctive historical pedigree of meting out disparate treatment for the hills and valley communities. So to suggest, for example, that these are outcomes of twisted colonial modernity and now being discomfort with or strongly inconvenient with this idea of institutional separateness between the hills and the valley as one of the modicum of bringing about united Manipur falls flat on the ground, because after all, the kind of division between the hills and the valley is real and it is palpable on the ground. And so long as you have integrationist as well as majoritarian impulse which seeks to dissolve this historical distinctive institution, what I call sub-state constitutional asymmetrical institutions, like the Village Authority Act, the District Council Act, the Hill Areas Committee, which is mandated, constitutionally mandated, to regulate matters pertaining to the development and affairs or schedule matters pertaining to the hill areas. And I think until and unless you make all this work, and remember that this is the same government which have not held election for the district council since the lapse of the term which was constituted in 2015, suggests that it is, the lack of democratic commitment, the lack of capacity of the state to establish a semblance of legitimacy as well as trust from the hill people that have spawned in this level of distrust as well as suspicion. So on top of that, when the Manipur High Court, directed by the state government to take a call within 4 weeks on whether to recommend or to forward, the representation of the Métis Scheduled Tribe Demand Committee or Métis Tribe Forum, you have this immediate trigger where the tribals interpreted this as one of the insidious way of snatching away tribal lands, because one of the grievances that the Métis in the valley had been historically complaining is that although the hill people had access to, and control over private property in the valley areas, the Métis living in the valley areas have not have this access to control as well as ownership of tribal land and property. So in that sense, the demand for scheduled tribe for the Métis, for example, is an end to rectify this historical sense of injustice. But if you really look at the bottom of it, this type of demand ought not to be driven exclusively by public sentiment, because after all, the yardstick or the modalities of recognizing a community, whether they be categorized as scheduled tribe or not, is defined by constitutional process, which are way laid out in a series of recommendations that the Commissioner for Scheduled Tribe give from 1950, and by 1965, the UN Debar Committee, in effect, has come out with a set of 4 criteria. And it is for the government of India, to decide, and the president to decide whether the Métis community fulfills the 4 acceptable criteria that has been evolved over time. And the matter should stop there. But you use that as an excuse to now relentlessly stereotype and target the cookies as if they are all illegal, they're all infiltrators, they're all narco-drug terrorists, and so forth, is beside the point. And I think this has led to a very antagonistic politics, which is not amenable to the idea of territorial shared space or the idea of unity. So to that extent, that so long as this mindset or this integrationist or majoritarian impulse continue, there is practically roadblocks or gridlocks in the way of realizing the idea of shared space. That's why in my recent article in the Queen, I said that in their overzealous attempt, to protect the territorial integrity of Manipur by investing themselves so much in this integrationist as well as majoritarian agenda, they have ruptured the territorial shared space, because the sharpened and the widening demographic as well as territorial divide between the Kuki Zou or the Kuki Zou Myanmar groups and the Métis have, in effect, aggravated almost beyond redemption now. And that is very unfortunate for people who really believed in institutions, who believe in the legitimacy and the trust that is invested in this institution. So the capacity of the state has to be restored. It has to be resuscitated in ways that lends legitimacy as well as promote trust across communities. Otherwise, the very idea of united Manipur might become increasingly difficult, if not impossible.